Hello, welcome everyone to the first webinar of the Grounded Knowledge Project. Our webinar theme today is what is grounded knowledge and why does it matter? I'm Tiffany Pewitt. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Diversity and Civic Life. And I'm here with our panelist, Harold Morales, who's at Morgan State University and the Director of the Center for Religion and Cities, Laura McTighe, who's at Florida State University, and my colleague, Elizabeth Melton, who is our Community Engagement Director with IDCL. And here in a moment, I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves. Before we get started, let me tell you just briefly about IDCL, in case you're not familiar with us, and also the Grounded Knowledge Project. IDCL, the Institute for Diversity and Civic Life, is a Texas-based nonprofit organization, and we have a mission to build more democratic public spaces through storytelling, research, and education. We've been around since 2015. I'm the founder and executive director. Basically, all of us at IDCL have a kind of academic background. Many of us have PhDs or other graduate training. And we bring a lot of kind of academic training and scholarship to the work that we do. And yet, we're not an academic institution or academic organization. We like to bridge or think of ourselves as bridging academic and public discourse, and as trying to determine like what kinds of insights and perspectives and resources can we glean from academic scholarship and bring into public discourse and bring into thinking about ways in which research can benefit the public good. So because of this aspect of our work, this has led us to having a lot of conversations about like, what does it mean to be engaged in public scholarship, but yet outside of an academic institution. What's more, as our work has evolved, we have realized that we're not just doing like traditional academic research and trying to distill that in some way for a public audience. We're actually working with community partners. And as we do this work, we are kind of rethinking what it means to be an expert, how we construct knowledge, what's the value of knowledge construction, how we can work with our community partners in mutually beneficial ways. And this approach to thinking about community-based research and public scholarship has led us into conversation with many different colleagues, Harold and Laura amongst them. And this in turn led to the creation of the Grounded Knowledge Project. It was seeded with conversations with colleagues about what does it mean to do this work? As we do this kind of work of community-based research, how are we thinking differently about our methodologies, about our ethics, about our outputs, about some of our assumptions about the production of knowledge? And so at the end of last year, we received a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation, and we're very grateful for their funding for the Grounded Knowledge Project, which is a larger initiative to build networks and resources and gathering spaces for folks who are doing this work, folks who are have been actively involved in this work for a while, as well as folks who are new to this work and are trying to kind of figure out the ins and outs and whatever kinds of learning curves they may be confronting as they begin to build relationships and work with communities and think about research in new ways. So I'm very happy that you get to join us for our inaugural webinar. And in this webinar, we are basically going to be kind of starting from the beginning and talking about like, what is this work that we're doing? And The next three webinars that we'll be hosting will kind of build on this conversation. And if you're interested, we'll share more information about that a little bit later. Okay, so with that introduction, I'd like to invite Laura and Harold to share with us. Maybe Laura, you'd like to go first and share with us, introduce us to yourself, to the work that you've been doing, and tell us a little bit about, how you got involved in this work, what it means to you, and what's inspired you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tiffany. And thanks to all of you who are here with us today, and to anyone who after the fact is going to be tuning in to listen to this conversation. So my name is Laura McTighe. As Tiffany already shared, I'm on faculty at Florida State University. I'm also the co-founder and associate director of Front Porch Research Strategy in New Orleans, which is an applied participatory action research institute. I am also working on two different projects that are funded through the Luce Foundation. The one as a PI with my colleagues, Elaine Oliphant and Daniel Baca, called Creating the World Anew, which is working on questions of religion, economy, and mutual aid. The other, the Kelly House Project, which was co-conceived with my colleague Jamil Drake, who's at Yale Divinity School, is focused on the work of Black women health activists in the South and the intersections of race and religion and health activism. So that menu of many hats already gives you a little bit of an introduction into my work as a community based to really, I use community driven over community based or community engaged to emphasize who's really in charge of the work that I am doing and privileged to do. But I want to give you, per Tiffany's note, a little bit more of an orientation to how I got to where I am. So often when I do more informal introductions, I say that I was born in Baltimore, but I was raised in our country's movements to end AIDS and abolish prisons. And that is my entry point into doing this work. I come as a community person first. Community work is what made me want to get a PhD and to try to figure out how to bring all of the tools and resources that I could muster and put them in the hands of people that I knew that were on the front lines of building a world that was more survivable than our present. And both of those origin stories, the movement to end AIDS and movements to abolish prisons, also brought me into touch with research in ways that were very different from what I had encountered as a college student. So in the movement to end AIDS, some of the earliest work, the reason why HIV is often talked about now as a long-term chronic illness over a death sentence is directly due to the advocacy of people living with HIV who went to every single research meeting, went to the halls of power to demand that the dollars of science research be put behind finding the meds that were going to keep people alive. And so my very first entry point into doing AIDS activist work was going to major global meetings, storming into sessions where bench scientists were presenting research, figuring out how to find the community accountable researchers who understood that sometimes we need science to say what community folks already know. So some of our heroes were folks out in San Francisco who were like, yes, we're going to do a study that shows that people who are actively using drugs are able to be adherent to HIV meds because we know you need that to be able to advocate for the next policy step. So I had, on the one hand, from HIV, this kind of almost antagonistic relationship with research, knowing that community folks were the people who were driving the best research that was happening. And in the movements to abolish prisons, a lot of that work for me came from the kind of thought and labor of the people who co-founded Critical Resistance, many of whom were people who were also academically located. And we're trying to understand how is our entire infrastructure of this country wrapped up in mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex? And what does it look like to build a movement of liberation in which we can imagine a future beyond that? So those both gave me very different appreciations for the role, the connection between work on the ground and research, and how research can be working to help support communities in answering really life and death questions. Coming into religious studies, which has always been my academic home, these aren't methods that are as familiar. And I think it's a part of what has been so life-giving about meeting Tiffany, about meeting Harold and other people through this project. Tiffany and I talked a lot about in our first conversations how many of us have been sort of doing this work in silos, and being able to come together through this project and through the network that we're opening here was life-giving for us, and we hope that it will be the same for all of you. The last bit that I'll offer on, for me, what it's meant to bring the religious studies to the table before passing over to Harold. I think for me, religious studies is an invitation to asking really big world-building questions. The people that I've partnered with, I'll talk more about that in our next go around, by and large are people who are working outside of churches, outside of traditional religious infrastructure, and much of that's really intentional, and comes from a lot of the really devastating impact of religion on people living with HIV and on people who are in heavily criminalized communities. And yet, there is something sacred in the work of trying to build a world in which we can live and thrive and not just survive. And that, for me, is the invitation of why does it matter to have religious studies at this community engaged, community directed table? And also, what does it look like to be working within this field in support of these huge visions for change and transformation that are bubbling up on the ground all around us? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Laura. So like similarly, I mean, and I think all of us come up in our various communities. So for me, my parents migrated from Guatemala to Los Angeles at the invitation of my grandfather, who was a pastor and started some churches in Guatemala and then started a church in Los Angeles. Now there was a big earthquake in Guate, and my parents were coming to what they thought would be a kind of temporary stay here, but they ended up having my older brother was born in Guate, and he went on the trek as well as an infant. And then my older sister was born in LA, and then I was born in my younger brother. And the church, there was a Pentecostal church that they belonged to that had largely a Central American population. And the church was very important for their survival and thriving in diaspora in Los Angeles, away from family, away from traditions, away from support systems. The church became a really important place for us to be able to live and thrive, to pass on traditions. So like a lot of the Spanish that I spoke and learned was done at church, in family, and in these religious communities. I went by my middle name, Danny, and in school and in English speaking communities, I went by Harold. And so like I had a very kind of like code switchy split sort of identity going on. But that community provided a space for us to feel welcome, to feel supported, to help navigate through the different structures in Los Angeles. And I remember when my dad lost a job once, and we were both like housing and food insecure, the church stepped in, the community stepped in to help feed us. And we're actually getting some of the like the name brand foods and things that we never got before because we couldn't afford it. And so like I remember that being a kind of interesting time for me. That was like both like I could sense the anxiety and concerns from my parents and older siblings, but at the same time we were also getting really good stuff. And I think like that those were formative experiences for me that I kind of took, and I have a complicated relationship with the church. There's a lot of things that I disagree with, but there's also a lot of fond memories. So it's this kind of like approach that I picked up in a lot of different places. I tend to look at things in terms of their possibilities and limitations. And so like for me, when I draw back on those memories, it's important for me to hold both at the same time. Right, where were some of the more limiting things about being in community, but also what were some of the possibilities? And I bring that to the work that I do. So like it was definitely part of what interested me in religious studies itself, to kind of unpack the role that religion had played in those formative years for myself, but that it continues to play for diaspora communities and others as well, seeking to form solidarity groups. So in that regard, I'm very interested still in the role that religion plays in forming community, in forming solidarity movements, movements of support, mutual aid, collectively asking those questions that Laura was mentioning, the big world forming questions in community, like where are the spaces that we have? And so I think academia is another space where we can have those questions with a different set of tools, but it also has a lot of possibilities and also a lot of limitations. And I think that when I arrived in Baltimore to work at Morgan State, so I'm an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion. I continued to do a lot of the direct action work around food security and food systems, housing insecurity, and trying to shore up those things, and funding and support and resources around immigration reform. And so like I was just personally invested in a lot of this work, and I would invite students and colleagues and let them know what was going on. But in terms of like experiencing those possibilities and limitations, academia gave me a lot of language, a lot of ability to pay close attention and critical attention, to read text, to imagine the situation and contextualize it and understand like broader historical trends and waves and movements. And so it's been very, very helpful. And yet there was this kind of piece that was like a limitation. I think the silos is one way to start thinking about what those limitations could be, and that we are searching for ways to break out of those molds. A few of us, and it's really cool to be in this group of conversation partners, because we trade, right? Like lessons learned, challenges experienced, and I hope that that's one thing that kind of comes up in this conversation. That there is something that inspires us to be in these spaces, these in between spaces, between community and academia, between different methodologies, between different subfields that we're all in, that there's something to be said about being in those in-between spaces. And yeah, like I said, I'm excited to kind of explore that.
Thanks, y'all. I really love hearing your stories, and it's just kind of reminding me about well, our first conversations that we have, and how invigorating it feels to be in conversation with y'all, to be able to hear other people talk about their work, and just to see the creativity and the imagination and all the potential that there is to especially, you know, working collaboratively, and to be able to affect change, to be able to you know, build these relationships, and to be able to be in solidarity with folks. And you know, I think a lot of us have had these experiences where we've been, you know, trained in more traditional academic research methods, in which you know, our training kind of told us that we were supposed to be objective in some way as researchers, or neutral in some way, or that we are not supposed to, you know, enter into research projects with you know, a particular agenda in mind beyond our research questions. But I think that, you know, that of course, that orientation in and of itself is not neutral, and is, you know, embedded with a lot of epistemological assumptions about norms. And then it also, you know, it just I think it doesn't work for many of our lives, and for our interest, and for our communities, and for the relationships that that we have. So it's really exciting to hear about what's brought you to your work. And we talked about, you know, we all met before this webinar to talk about like, how do we want to organize our conversation? So we're organizing it around a few questions. So the next question that we all agreed that we wanted to talk about is just to spend a little more time and talk about the work that we're doing and what that really looks like, more detail about our organization or project, and to talk a little bit too about the process of doing this work, some of the obstacles that and challenges that we faced, what it's been, what it looks like in terms of creation and implementation and sustainability. So I want to say a few things about what that looks like here at IDCL. And, you know, I'll say that our work at IDCL is primarily, aside from the Grounded Knowledge Project and well, and a couple of other initiatives we have, but a lot of it is very Texas focused. And it is driven, you know, out of a concern about the way that we have seen those in positions of power who are, you know, really actively working to dismantle democracy and to really push Christian nationalist ideologies on what's a very large and very diverse state. The state is not I mean, contrary to what you may hear about Texas, the state is not a white Anglo evangelical Christian majority, but yet that's the majority of folks that are in positions of power. And they continually build narratives, and those narratives connect to policy that marginalize anyone who doesn't look or think like them. And so IDCL, you know, the work that we do here is really centered on like, how do we build a more capacious narrative of Texas, and how do we do this work in a way that might help build a Texas that actually works for all the people who live here, because I can tell you that right now it does not. And we've done this in a number of different ways, but one project that I will highlight right now is our Religions Texas initiative. And it's an oral history project to gather stories from folks who are part of communities that have really experienced that kind of marginalization that has happened because of this very kind of coercive dominant narrative that has gotten so much attention. And, you know, there's a lot about this project that is pretty simple and straightforward. It's like we go and we gather people's stories, and they tell us about their lives and who they are, and you know, their hopes and their dreams and their concerns and their work. And then that is we have a digital community archive in which all of those oral histories are housed. But the way we've gone about doing this is in relationship with communities. And, you know, we've spent a lot of time with our various community partners talking to them about the stories that they feel like have been left out and are not heard, and the ways in which they felt that they really want to kind of elevate certain themes, certain topics, and you know, certain realities of their lives. And in working with them, we make sure that the stories that we include in this project are very much theirs and represent their interest. We don't have a particular agenda, you know, on our side from IDCL to create a particular narrative. We just want that narrative that we're you know, working with our partners to kind of build and co-author. We want that narrative to be theirs, and to not be one that just reflects these kinds of dynamics of dominance, which is, you know, how a lot of stories of Texas you know, have been shaped and formed. So, you know, the Religions Texas project, we're about 3 years in. We have found that, you know, one reality of doing this kind of community-based work, in which, you know, part of the work is having lots of conversations with community partners really before any work really happens, right? Or that is the work, like the conversational part is the work. But it means that there's this project has been in many ways like it moves at its own pace. There's a lot that has to kind of marinate along the way. Like we have conversations with folks, and then we have follow-up conversations with folks, and then we talk again, and then we talk again. And so, you know, one of the challenges that we've run into is that sometimes in more traditional academic work, you want to create this timeline and say, we're going to start here and we're going to end here, and this is what we're going to accomplish along the way. But that's not necessarily how work unfolds organically when you're really working with community partners in mutually beneficial ways. So we've had to find ways to rethink, you know, some of these the kinds of terms that come up in more traditional work, like objectives and deliverables and timelines and schedules, and you know, how to imagine these in mutually beneficial ways that just let the work unfold. And so we're 3 years into this project, and we are continuing to work on it. And we I think in many ways don't have a particular end date in sight, because the stories continue and are ongoing. And then for us, that also has created a challenge that, quite frankly, we don't, you know, we haven't completely figured out, you know, how to address, which is what does the larger timeline of this project look like? And you know, I think that that's where continuing to be in conversation with folks to see what we find and discover. Laura, would you like to share about your work?
Sorry, you had a technical difficulty. My cursor went into an odd corner of the screen, and all of a sudden everyone disappeared. So I feel like it's a good segue from Tiffany, what you said of like you make the timeline and then everything sort of goes at its own pace. That I was having literally one of those moments in real time here with you all. Yeah, the part of I love, I mean, we came up with this agenda together, but it's still, I think, being able to get into the nitty-gritty of this work matters so much for having this conversation. I think it was reflecting on that, Harold, as you were talking about the kind of in-betweenness, that there's the kind of being in the big heady conceptual space, like those are some of the tools, and the fine-grained detailed reading, those are the tools that academia gives us, and the like ability for being in the flow as everything goes off the rails is such an essential part of what community-based work is. And you can't really figure out what it's like to occupy that in between space without being in it, without being in the work. So I can tell you a little bit about the last decade and a year of what being in the work has been like for me in partnership with my chosen family in New Orleans. So as one of a kind of project labor of love, I'm not even sure what the right word is for it, but where my heart and home and everything have been is in partnership with an organization called Women with a Vision, which was is a Black feminist health collective founded in 1989 by a collective of Black women. Two of the co-founders, Danita Muse and Catherine Haywood, are still actively involved in the work today. And the founding collective of Women with a Vision came together from various points and posts in different health and human service positions across the city at the height of the AIDS epidemic, recognizing that what paltry resources were there were not getting to their communities. And they did what Black women have always done, formed a kind of grassroots direct action to get anything they could into their people's hands. And in doing that work, which we all now understand was research in the deepest sort of sense of mapping their communities, of working with people to build knowledge, they really pioneered what Black harm reduction looks like in the South. and also actively had that work taken from them by public health researchers who treated them like the people who were gathering data rather than the producers of knowledge that they were. When I met the Women with a Vision collective was pretty soon after Hurricane Katrina. And there, I think we talk in a kind of long history of the organization about both that in the early days of the work, everything was so busy that there wasn't time to write it down. But I think there also have been multiple tragic events that have repeatedly underlined the ephemerality of Black archives and the processes of knowledge dispossession that have been present in Women with a Vision's history now for nearly 35 years. So I joined the organization at one of these moments in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, as our founders, Catherine's daughter, Dion, took the helm of the organization. She and her wife, Shaquita, Shaquita did a major career change into public health and were running all of the street-based outreach work. So as people from the Women with a Vision Network were able to return after Hurricane Katrina and to get back to the communities that they had always been the primary space of support for, so Black drug user, sex worker communities in New Orleans, people started showing up one by one with photo IDs that said sex offender on them. No one knew why. What people said was that they had heard that there was something about a crime against nature. And it was just person by person by person by person. So what began then was a kind of insurgent research process to understand what the heck was going on. And what Women with a Vision was able to piece together in partnership with a lot of community organizations and then with an incredible legal team, was learning that the state of Louisiana was using a 200-plus-year-old anti-sodomy statute to criminalize street-based sex work, to ratchet it up to a felony level registerable sex offense, and that most often how that law was being meted out was specifically on Black and brown sex workers, on people who were trans and people who were queer. So on the very communities that Women with a Vision had always been home for. Women with a Vision, in a kind of amazing process of a 5-year organizing fight, which I was on the ground with and offering support for, took on the state of Louisiana to challenge the statute and won. We're able to, in partnership with a team of attorneys, Andrea Ritchie, who people may know from the incredible work of Interrupting Criminalization, team of folks from the Center for Constitutional Rights, people down in Louisiana from Loyola Law School, took on the statute, were able to level the penalties and remove more than 800 people from the sex offender registry in the state. 2 months after the first major court victory, Women with a Vision's offices were firebombed and destroyed. And it was something that, walking through that office, there was no question that this was not a retaliation for Women with a Vision's organizing work, that it was an attack that was intended to destroy this work, to destroy an organization that had fought back against the state, fought back against the police, fought back against the status quo in New Orleans and Louisiana. And simultaneously, immediately after that attack, what we started seeing was that the attack was being exceptionalized. Women with a Vision, it was sort of a fluke thing, and never sort of named, never investigated attack. So that is really where the core of the research that I've been doing for the last decade began, knowing that this wasn't a single attack on a singular organization at a single moment in time, that fire means something in the South. And so we began what we call the process of research as survival, literally to like take all of the tools that we had of oral history work, of community-driven storytelling, of archive rebuilding, to try to recreate the archive that was lost. And in the process to ensure that Women with a Vision's work would continue. It's a deep and long process, I think one of the pieces that I wanted to pull out in thinking about in between this was just how important space is and was for this. I think it wasn't something that fully became, it came into focus really as we were coming towards the about 4 or 5 years after the arson attack, when Women with a Vision had been able to secure the first real home after that attack, and realizing, why does it matter to be able to take place, to have a space? Ruth Wilson Gilmore, geographer, says freedom is a place. And just that significance and understanding that this attack was part of the entire redesigning and sort of neo-colonial project of rebuilding New Orleans after the storm and making it impossible for hundreds of thousands of people, or for 100,000 people, Black people largely, to be able to return to the city of their birth. That this was an attack that was in and part of and produced by those same exact systems. And that meant that the places in which the knowledge that we were producing could happen, that taking those places mattered. And one of the core spaces, which was its own sort of in-betweenness, was the space of the front porch. So that is why the research institute that we founded coming out of this project is called Front Porch Research Strategy. It comes from an understanding that we believe in the revolutionary things that happen on the Southern front porch. It's why all of the work that we've been documenting, we sort of built different means of collective storytelling, because we knew that knowledge was always produced in community, and that was what mattered the most, was to be able to honor the multiplicity of voices that have historically come together, and the knowledge that can't ever be carried just by one person. And it's work that sort of continued deeply in and through presence with community. It's not to say there are plenty of pieces. I think every sort of turn, there were pieces that were working and not working. And I think a big part has been to stay in it, to talk about the things that, to talk about the moments that come up when stuff feels raw, to talk about the moments when we think that we thought that we knew what we were doing, and actually we need to be doing something different. And I think part of the strength and skill that Women with a Vision had in leading that process came from that being exactly what the organization had always done, as a community-based organization. If you're in it, you're really in it. And maybe to wrap up on a point that Tiffany already shared for us, I think all of our work comes back to a truth that the Women with a Vision's co-founder, Catherine Haywood, says, which is, you have to build a relationship. When you have that, you can do anything. But if you don't have a relationship, then there isn't any way to do this work. So those relationships are what moved us into figuring out processes of collective authorship, of deciding what should and shouldn't be written down, of deciding what are the things that needed to be protected so that they could continue, because to air them would just make them open to surveillance. All of those things always drilled back down into our relationships and meant the process was never quite linear. It was certainly not what we began and thought we were charting out. But we're now, I think, and really excited to be within the next 6 months producing our first collectively authored book on the subject, and also bringing the living archive of the work that we've been producing out into the world as well. So I'll pass to Harold now.
That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that, Laura, and Tiffany as well. Like you both brought up a lot of important things, and I'm so glad that we get to engage and wrestle with. Tiffany, you were talking about like when does a project, a work come to an end, and I think that's also something that I've been thinking a lot about, in connection also with, yeah, when is something completed so that it could then be delivered to whoever it is that you're delivering it to. So in terms of yeah, project oriented, grant speak, the deliverable. I also thanks, Laura, for bringing up the space of where this happens, and I love the front porch methodology image that comes to mind. and that's also something that I wrestle with. Like, where does this work happen? Like, when does it happen? So what's the longevity of it? Where's the space? But also in terms of the issue, like if it's food insecurity, like where's the space in terms of where we're addressing food insecurity? How long are we going to address it for? When do we say that the work has been completed and we've addressed the issue and can then deliver the thing that we accomplished? Um, and these are like daunting questions that can be paralyzing for me at times. And so like it is, but and yet we do the work. We take the step. And we learn and we come up with answers to the questions that oftentimes we'll have to change with the movements of the work. So I started doing this. I founded the Center for Religion Cities in 2018. It was the same year that my book came out, Latino and Muslim in America, and talking about like what academia makes possible. A whole lot of relationships came into existence during that research that culminated in this book that then I delivered right to the publisher, and then things happened. And it felt like a bow tie. It felt like a culmination of a work, and where I could kind of signal, okay, this is where it comes to an end. But it raised a lot of questions in terms of possibilities. This was really cool. We got this done. A lot of relationships were built, but limitations as well. It was really hard to get through the work when the field of religious studies itself had been divided up into these like, okay, so we have Latino religions over here, and there are these like 3 or so many like subgroups at the American Academy of Religion that kind of engage those topics. And then there's Islamic studies, Quranic studies, Islam in America, subfields and groups and units over there. And here I am in between like both of these sets of like subfields within religious studies, which is already kind of like doing interesting things as well in terms of coming up with categories and yeah. So like I was struggling already academically with like these kind of areas and being in between, and how to like go to all of the academic talk, all the panels, right? So like all these different units. And then there was also like my own personal interest around art and media and religion. And so I was very interested in like technological determinism and media determinism and identity formation, these sorts of things. And so like I was going to these as well. And so feeling split, feeling like having to like run between places. I was reflecting on the conferences, and I think one of my favorite things about them was the labyrinthine like aspect to it, of running around the conference spaces and the hotels and stuff like that. And that was fun. That was fun for me, and it gave me some time to process and think about things. And so like when the book came to an end, right, and I was finishing it up, I was working on the conclusion, and in the conclusion, I was very critical of most of the work itself. So much time had transpired, and so many relationships had come into existence and moved and twisted and turned in different ways, that by the time I was done with it, I was in a different place and was very critical of it. And the conclusion is a critique of it. But I was interested in these like possibilities for solidarity movements, and so like I think with reflecting on a taco truck at every mosque campaign that tried to, it was getting some media attention, and it was trying to bring together Latinx community members with Muslim community members to try to address immigration reform, to work to create solidarity movements. And at the same time, right, so like I spent this conclusion just critiquing the sort of scholarly journey that I had taken and conclusions that I had come to. And in it, I was trying to like also bridge this kind of insider-outsider thing that was going on, and speak both with this like neutral, objective voice that doesn't exist, and at the same time being in community with the organizations that I had been working with and walking alongside and providing recommendations. So like, maybe you shouldn't do this, or maybe you should do that. Seeing myself as both insider and outsider, and kind of like trying to figure out that divide. So at the end, I was very critical of it. And this was kind of like my training, though. It was in academia. So when we think about like knowledge production, and then public knowledge production on top of that. The first thing that comes to mind is like folks like Foucault and Edward Said and David Chittister, where knowledge production is it's a term that became useful to like critique power and the role that power plays in the construction of knowledge. And so like I'm very interested in how we all like engage or address or approach public knowledge production and the issue of power that plays in all of this, and then especially as we see a lot of funding from philanthropic organizations like the Luce Foundation, Mellon, and others, Lilly, to support public knowledge production. What does that mean? So I'm very interested in that, but very critical, right? A lot of my scholarship, I was trained to be critical. And then I was like frustrated, like, okay, so like, is that all that I do? Is that my lane? Do I describe and critique? Because I want to construct something as well. I want to build something. I want to do something. I don't just want to critique these issues. I want to start addressing food insecurity. I want to start addressing the lack of funding for public schools. I want to do something constructive in addition to. And so I think that was a big part of the inspiration. And I was like, okay, so where are the spaces that I'm going to be in to address this? What is my capacity? What is it I'm already doing? What are my relationships that I already have? And how can so the same year that the book was completed, I was awarded a Luce grant to start the Center for Religion in Cities. And these were some of the things that were going on. And so like I found a few spaces, and land, I think, is the starting point for a lot of this work. Like, where do we find ourselves, and what are we already in relationship with? What are our responsibilities that we've taken up with the land and people on that land? And so that was a starting point for me. And Baltimore became the space, the land, the city of Baltimore, in which I imagined I would do the work, but still struggling with these questions of like capacity, of size, of longevity, so world religions just felt way too big, way too big to like teach in a class or engage in any sort of substantial way. Religion in America also felt really big for me. Baltimore still feels really big, but a lot of the work that we've done is focused on the city, and so like there are things like like city council, the mayor's office, and then like at the state level and how it impacts the city. And so those are places where like I can kind of wrap my head around, and I was working with people like Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, Baltimoreans United in Leadership Development, CASA Maryland, and others. And so like getting to know that and that part of it, and what role religious studies, and spirituality and other sorts of fields and approaches could play in understanding, unpacking, critiquing. But also, I think I love the framing of your project, Laura, like in terms of building worlds anew, like there is this kind of creative impulse that I wanted to nurture. And so like those spaces were exciting to me in some ways, but they also felt big, a little too big for me. It ended up like gravitating to a little farm in Park Heights with big dreams, and I spend most of my time there in this urban farm. And the issues that we're addressing often have to do with food insecurity and food apartheid, and even that, like we give out boxes of food on Thursdays. We go to farmers markets and give out food to folks who and sell food. And I think that's a really important part. And when we feed one person one meal, like I'm like, okay, delivered. Like that's the work has been done. It's been completed. Like I did this thing. Or if like we're eating and we have a conversation, cool, like success, like the thing is done. And yet there's still so much more work to do. So I keep coming and showing up. But like food insecurity in the city feels really big, and yet we try in community collectively. And then I, as an individual, like, right, I bring these sort of very relational one-on-one or small group sort of practices because it's what feels right for me. But there are other folks who can like feel more comfortable in those more like political spaces and city hall and things like that. And so I think part of the journey, part of the work was like learning to like lean in with each other, to understand what is it that inspires each other and where we align, and move together. And so, like, for me, community, like, the projects were a means to developing those relationships and getting to know each other and finding, like, those ways that we could support each other when the time comes. Because as Tiffany was saying, like, the stories keep happening, like, life keeps happening. And when like we have crises, when we have exciting possibilities, it's nice to have those communities that we already have a relationship with, those people that we already have a relationship with, to kind of move a little bit more gracefully through it. So I think of projects and deliverables and timelines as kind of like just tools, but that the actual goal or the movement that's being made is in those relationships with land and with people. And when I listen to folks going through things, okay, so then, all right, so how can we use projects and project management and academia to help understand, unpack, have conversations, shape the space in a way that is mutually life-giving to us. And some of the work, this has come in a lot of different ways. So recently, like, I spent a lot of time at the farm helping, supporting, listening, being involved in any way that I can, and letting the leadership at the farm lead the projects. And so when something happens, I'm like, okay, this is what I can do. We're like, we have a circle and we're talking about it. This is what I can do. This is what I can do. And this is what I can't do. And it was only like 2.5, maybe 3 years before I proposed my own thing. That came, like, out of my heart. And I've been reading the Popol Vuh. I've been walking a lot and reading it to the rivers in Baltimore and other places and spaces. And I thought I'd wanted to have a small reading group of 4 people at the farm, and including one of the farmers. And so, like, Farmer Tiara read the Popol Vuh along with us and grew corn. Corn is one of the important sort of substances that humans are made from in the creation story, this Mayan creation story. And she read it, and her reflection was growing corn, making a meal, and I think she came up with a dance as well. I had an artist, like, that was working, good friend, was from Nicaragua, and their reflections were paintings and drawings and sketches of what they were reading, and I was, like, dictating reflection, like philosophical reflections and project management reflections on my reading. And the, like, small group came together and we did the thing, and more people started joining. I had this, like, anxiety about putting these big public talks or things together and no one shows up. In this case, like, I was like, we're not going to announce anything. We're just going to have this reading group. It's going to be an opportunity for us to kind of reflect on the work that we do here at the farm. And people started showing up, and we were giving away copies of the book, and more people came, and it ended up being a much bigger sort of thing than we anticipated. And I think that's another part of what I've been learning through this work is that, we come up with these plans, and we have these visions of what it might be. But in the end, like, those are helpful because they get us there, and they get us to, like, come prepared with a set of tools. So, like, I could have my paints, and I could have my books, and I can have all these, like, lesson plans and things like that, and I'm there. And things change. And I think I draw on, like, sort of the possibilities from the Pentecostal tradition that I came from. I like to say, when I'm in these spaces, as the Spirit moves, I'm prepared with these things, and yet I can use those tools, those items, those materials in different creative ways. And I like that. I like the opportunity to be creative. And so I think I found a way to kind of do those things that bring me joy in community, and lean in with those folks that have the skills and tools and materials that I don't, and ask for help when I need help. But I think a lot of this has been driven by this question of, like, how do we thrive together? How do we flourish together? And what do we each bring to the table? And so it's been like an exercise in relationship building and the important role that clear communication plays in being able to develop those.
I love that, Harold. Thank you for sharing all of that. We had said that we were going, like, our third question was going to be that we would all kind of talk a bit about why all this work matters. But we're running a little over in time, and I want to give a little time for questions from those of us who have joined us today. But I also think we have talked about why this work matters. I think we've all been talking about this, and it also occurs to me too that that is how you talk about this work, right? That's such a subtext, and that it's not why the work matters. It's that we do the work because it matters. We do the work because there is deep need in our world. And it strikes me too that, we've all talked about in different ways how part of our academic training was that we gained these conceptual frameworks that allow us to critique the way that power operates in our society, and have also like really kind of laid bare the ways in which historically so much knowledge production, particularly in the academy, has been in the service of dominance and colonization. And so like as we're aware of this and we do this sort of deconstruction, it then leads us to the next step is like, okay, so what do we do with this? How do we create knowledge that's not in the service of colonization? How do we create knowledge that's in the service of, solidarity and community and, building that better world that, we and our, community partners are actively imagining every day. And I think in many ways, trying to work in this way, I think people have been doing it for a very long time. It's certainly not new. We're not creating something brand new or inventing something. But within the discipline of religious studies, we're paving some new paths. This is not how we were trained to do this work. And so there are lots of like questions. In fact, and at least I feel like in my experience, frequently more questions raised than solutions come to, at least at the moment. Before we kind of turn it over to or open up to some questions from folks, do you all feel like you could maybe encapsulate in like say a couple sentences like this, why you think this work matters, so we can kind of get to that question, but in a very condensed sort of way?
I can try to go first since I've usually been following you. And this is something I started writing down, Harold, is what you were sharing. That there is such a like beautiful and important juxtaposition for me between food insecurity term and the work that you're doing at the farm. And I think that I'm trying to think how I want to say this, that the violence that we are all working against is part of it's hardwired into the way that we're told the world exists. We're told that we live in a world, and we produce that world when we buy into ideas of abstraction, things that take us out of relationship with one another, out of relationship with the land. And at the moment when we refuse that, we begin the process of creating something different. In the moment when we recognize that the world that we live in is in fact radically connected, it's even connected in the violence that's happening. Like to put back in the hands that are doing the violence is actually, it's a way of refusing a logic of abstraction and saying, we want to know how things are moving, because if we can see how things are moving, then we can move them differently. I feel like that also for me then like opens up this possibility for how to move across really dramatic scales. It's a way of thinking that I get from my geographer colleagues, but like Harold, it came up so clearly for me and what you were talking about. It's such an essential part of Women with a Vision's work, how to like sitting in like the early days of the founders' work to be on the street, bringing harm reduction tools, talking to folks who are in a balcony overhead, and to move from that intimacy of that moment of how do we get you what you need to be as safe as possible into a global network of sex workers organizing. And like that scale is actual, like you can literally trace the people at every step of how we got there. So I think that piece of refusing abstraction and rerouting in intimacy and recognizing that intimacy is actually how we get to these, like, I thought I was coming here to do this, but as the spirit moves, I really loved that part too, because I feel it really deeply. Um, but that's one of the pieces that I wanted to offer. And then I think the other is like, why the word revolution and what does that mean in Women with Visions lexicon? And we really take it from the freedom fighter Kwame Ture, who taught us that if all you're doing is destroying, you're not a revolutionary. Revolution is about creating. Dion, my dear friend Dion, who runs Women with a Vision now, talks about it as like revolution means to have a plan. Like, we're all here today. Tell me what you're going to do tomorrow. Tell me what you're going to do the day after that. I want to still see you here. I want to be in relationship with you. And so I think those two pieces matter the most for me. And I think connect to this. If we release a kind of stranglehold on prediction, which I think is also a different form of abstraction. So the kind of idea that we're going to write a grant report and tell you what you're going to get on the other end, which not just in our foundation world. I mean, this was like a strategy of movement funding that literally destroyed movements by trying to make people accountable to concrete campaign outcomes, rather than to the process and networks of community building. So across the board, those sort of like different processes of abstraction that wrangle us into projects that aren't actually going to produce something new. They're going to reproduce the world that we're living in. So, and those are some of the pieces that I think that become open and become possible. So to refuse abstraction, to be open to the fact that we don't actually know how this is going to turn out, but we can stand in commitment to one another. And then I think this sort of like beautifully, like the most challenging thing, and Harold, I heard this in what you were saying as well, is to like, to kind of know your lane, to know what skills you're bringing, and to like, by being really like, really in tune with the gifts that you have and with the gifts that other people have, that like, how wonderfully freeing that is, because there are things I'm great at that like are not the same things that Dion's great at, are not the same things that her wife Shaquita is great at. And we at some point started realizing that like when the three of us came together, there was magic that happened. We call it the tricycle effect. But like we can't like, and Dion's always the big wheel, so we're always clear about that too. But like the tricycle effect is how we move. We move in three-part harmony, and that kind of lesson replicated that like we just everything good we do with other people, and that is in the intimacy of the three of us in our tricycle through to the largest scales of power, that is actually how we build something different.
Thanks for that. I mean, there's so many reasons why this matters, right? So many different reasons. But I think one thing that I want to raise here is just the future of the humanities itself and where it might be heading. And the way that I experienced academia was both like, again, provided a whole lot of possibilities for me that weren't there before. But it also came with a whole lot of limitations. And I think one of those limitations for me personally was a rupture with communities that I had been with before. And I think one of the things that this kind of work allows for is a reconnection with land and communities. And I think Laura articulated really well that there's a move towards abstraction. And Tiffany also put it really well that there's a move towards colonization and colonial practices in academia. And so part of it has been just kind of like, yeah, who do we hang out with in academia? Who are we talking with? Who inspires us? Who are we reading? But also like, what's the next step here? Like, where are we going? And if the world keeps changing and the situation keeps changing, and Tiffany, I think you mentioned like this isn't new, and some of it is new to some parts of religious studies, but others that are like more steeped within like theological settings or ministry settings, like folks have been doing this kind of work, and that's part of the in-between space that I occupy, right? So like I come out of a ministerial background with my family and myself in younger years, and so like bridging those spaces, but also like, yeah, we see the writing on the wall. What is the future of the humanities? And there are severe critiques of academia in general. And so like, why does this matter? I think part of it is because there are a lot of possibilities within academia. There are a lot of tools and resources that have been helpful and life-giving to me. And there are a lot of problems and limitations and harm that happens within academic spaces as well. And so I think it matters because I think we can do better. And I think we can, step into this moment that we're living in the world. And it is a moment, and we will hand off a set of materials and memories and resources and tools to another generation. And so I feel like a whole lot of weight and importance, and also at the same time, Flora was saying, like, I have a role to play here. It's huge. It's a huge issue, and it matters deeply. And I'm not alone. So like, it's really nice to be able to do this in solidarity with you all and others.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Does anyone who's joined us today have any questions for us? I feel like we've shared a whole lot, and there's probably a million questions that could be asked and that we might have ourselves. But I want to open up to anything that's lingering for you, questions about particularly about work that we're doing, or ways that you're thinking about your own work. Or anything that's come up for you. Hi, Margaret.
Hi, Tiffany. I don't have any specific questions. I'm a slow processor, so they'll come up like probably later this weekend. But I just wanted to say thank you so much, because this conversation has been beautiful, and you've articulated so many of the questions and challenges that I just keep bumping up against. No, not that direction. No, not that direction, that have come out of the academic setting. And I finished the PhD just as COVID was starting. And so it's been 3 years of like, what's next? And just hearing y'all talk gives me hope. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. And Tiffany, maybe we could get together and have some coffee or something here in
Yes.
Austin.
It's really nice to see your
And
face.
continue the conversation. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Good to
I
see
would
you
love
too.
that.
And thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Hi, Andrew.
Hi, I'm Andrew Hudson. I don't work in academia anymore. I have a PhD in religious studies. I also, Harold, came from a Pentecostal background, 4 generations in there, which did create this amazing divide of studying my own tradition, with having the humanities inform me, but also wedge me between some of those traditions as well. But now I currently work in a collective impact nonprofit organization. And so I live in the intersection between economic development and education. And ironically, one of the biggest things that I have to do is try to navigate what does it look like to springboard people through education to get them to viable economic opportunity, which oftentimes puts them in a space of cutting out some of the humanities through instruction, which is heartbreaking, but also realistically, as someone who also came through humanities training and didn't have any viable employment on the other side of it, I've looked at that. So I'm interested categorizing that, or putting that off to the side, at ways in which you've been able to generalize some of the humanistic thought that we developed in our academic spaces in community application, because I'm thinking about that in behavioral aspects of economics, as well as identity construction as we're building career pathways for underserved and underrepresented populations of the city where I'm at here in Chattanooga, Tennessee right now, and trying to generalize those practices to be able to employ them in other cities around the country as well. So what have you been able to work with either nonprofits or government to try to generalize some of that humanistic thought that we were able to develop in religious studies?
I could say something about process and imagination and inspiration. I imagine Laura might have more examples as well along that might be relevant here. But So I was mentioning the Popol Vuh work, the creation story that I've been doing. And I think part of what I see coming is what you just articulated, Andrew, that there are material needs. Um, when I first went to college, I was a computer graphics major, and I wanted a job doing what I love doing, sketching. Um, and I took a philosophy class, and then that was like really interesting. But the joke that I make, like my parents were very worried for me, and but the joke was like I wasn't, yeah, I was or what I would say is like I'm not here for a job. I'm just gonna wander. I'm just gonna keep like I'm gonna be on a perpetual pilgrimage with a degree, and because all I want to do is read and talk to people and have these conversations. But like again, coming out of this like immigrant diaspora experience, and my parents experiencing a lot of economic and material hardship, they were very concerned for me. So like I think what I see, especially for those of us that think about education or come to education as a way out or as a way of gaining like economic stability, um, that the humanities don't figure very prominently in that narrative and that goal and that trajectory. And so then if that's the case, and if that's going to be increasingly the case across the US, where do we have these opportunities to read, to write, to like think slowly, deeply? As Margaret would say, I'm also a slow processor. It takes me a while. I need to like, and so where does this happen? And so part of what I'm interested in is, yeah, like what does the humanities look like at the farm while doing farming? Right. So like for you, it might be like, what does the humanities look like, or what role might it play in, I don't know, like a meeting or something like with two new partners. So something that we're doing and that grew out of the Popol Vuh reading group is like project management is it's an amazing science and training and like set of tools for productivity. Love it. Like I can't say enough about it. And I like all the like different handbooks and trainings, and I'm sending my team to do all this stuff. And also it's really tedious and boring work. It's really tedious and boring work oftentimes, unless I can imagine it in a different way, right? So if I'm walking in the city and I'm just trying to get from point A to point B, it could be like a task that's frustrating and daunting and boring and not liking it. It's just something I have to get through. But if I can imagine myself like Spider-Man or like Deserto walking in the city, and looking for like all these critiques, then it's an enjoyable experience. So part of what we've been trying to do at the center in terms of project management is think of ourselves as, or that process as a creative process, right? We are creators, like the gods in the Popol Vuh that come together, and they're hanging out in stillness, and the water is still, and there's no movement, there's no ripples, and because of that, you can see like clearly through the water, because there's no movement. But and in that clarity, that moment of clarity, you're inspired. A vision comes to you about like what you would want to do, and eventually you got so much energy that you can't help but share it with other people. And so the gods start to confer their ideas, and once they start sharing it with each other, like okay, like what are we going to do? Like, well, if we do this, this is going to happen. And if we do that, that's going to happen. And they try, and then like it's a failure, and they like talk about this, like why it didn't work. And then they move. So then we incorporate this into the center's project management cycles, right? Where is our time of like rest and reflection, of stillness, to then get inspired? And when the visions start coming to us for like what we should do next or what we should do different, where are the spaces where we come together and start sharing that with each other, and anticipating successes and failures and challenges and barriers, together collectively? And once those conversations start happening, then like what's the next meeting? And we even do like kind of like Bible study sort of readings, reflective sort of grounding things. So it's not the Bible that we're reading, but it'll be something from the Popol Vuh, or something from Emergent Strategy, or something from Octavia Butler's sort of Afrofuturism fiction, and then try to ground the conversation that is very effective at getting work done, but also can be like tedious and daunting. And I think it brings a different kind of energy to it. But that's in terms of like the imagination and inspiration piece for doing work that needs to be done. I imagine, yeah, that others have other ways to kind of answer that question. A very good question, Andrew.
Yeah, I can try to chime in a little. Oh, Okay. Sorry, I was watching our grid shift in real time. Yeah, I can try to chime in a little, and Harold knows this about me, both that I have a long background in doing nonprofit-based work, and that most of my community-based work is with nonprofit organizations. So the space that you're talking about, Andrew, is the space that I've lived and worked in for the better part of the last 2 decades, actually closer to 25 years. I guess one piece that I would put out for thinking about the role of humanities work in economic development and nonprofit sort of engines working in that capacity. I think one place is the question of imagination that Harold put on. I'll give an example from the work that we do in New Orleans that I think helps to open that for me. One of the practices in all of the community education and like core-based diversion programs and anything that we're doing are working with people and building vision boards, and really treating those as kind of sacred products that are about not just being able to name what is. That may be where you're at if you're like kind of charting where am I right now, where do I want to be in the next 6 months, maybe in the next year, but in the space of trying to articulate something that's a longer term vision, how to sort of not only be reflecting on what is here and what you might be able to make small sort of tinkerings to make that a little bit more livable, but to get into a creative, imaginative space about what actually do you want to build, what do you want to make. And I think that shift, it's one that I know from organizers as well, that kind of making the impossible possible every day. I think that's a really critical piece, especially for those of us that are living in different forms of crisis or in different forms of scarcity. That type of economic precarity makes us have to be in survival mode, and that one of the tools and resources that the humanities can help to open up is how to be able to get out of that and into something that you're building bigger. Saying that was probably still a little bit abstract, so I want to try to give 2 examples of how and why it matters to pin that down. I think one is, this goes back to the point that I had said about abstraction in our last go around, that the world that we're living in is violent. Like, you're doing work that is trying to mitigate violence, and you're doing it by trying to get people more resources so they're not living in poverty. It's really easy for us when we're kind of boot on the neck in the systems to be thinking about just how do I get to the next day? How do I get to the next like thing? How do I just make sure that me and my family right here aren't going to be as precarious as we are? And usually when we're making decisions from that place, what we're doing is extending the system as it exists, which means we're actually making more violence for ourselves and others in the future. And I think one of the big humanities resources is how to stop and be like, okay, where are we going? What's the world that I live in? And what's the world that I want to be making? How can I take steps right now that are going to get me there? It's what my person abolitionist folks and friends call non-reformist reforms. So little changes that actually are about building something different, and that mean that you're not gonna, like in 5 years, be trying to undo the very thing that you just put in place. And that those are things and practices that we can do in kind of big, thinking about different interventions, thinking about different nonprofit projects. There are also things that we can do in our smallest sort of spaces as we're thinking about like my dream as an entrepreneur and what do I want to do. One of the concrete tools that I could give you that has really been transformational in a lot of the nonprofit-based work I've done is to be shifting from kind of capitalist modes to mutual aid. And that part of that type of a shift, which I think of also as something that's humanities driven, is it's asking us to think about how have we gotten through? Who are the people that we've leaned on? Like all of the stories, Harold, that you kicked us off with of talking about the churches, and like for so many of us, Our churches were the very first examples we had of mutual aid. There were the examples of like somebody who didn't know us anything, but just like knew that we were part of the same family in a kind of bigger sense, wanting to come out of their own pockets to help and offer support. And that's a really different model of economic development, to be thinking about like, how do I take the resources that I have for this project and use it to make all of us rise together? Like, so being able to ask those types of questions to me is what the benefit of bringing the humanities into nonprofit spaces is.
I have a question
Thanks.
for, thank you. I have a question for everyone, in regards to like challenges. What are like some of the challenges that you all have experienced, especially if community engaged work, right? Community engaged work as a form of public scholarship, if it is rooted in relationship, right? And the deliverables, as I'm thinking about it, are more of a tools. The projects and deliverables are kind of a tool or part of the journey, but that the journey is ultimately about relationships. That's hard work, right? And I think a lot of the challenges that I think are more significant and substantial for myself have been around relationships. So I wonder if you all could talk a little bit about those kinds of challenges that you've experienced, and some lessons that you've learned.
I asked if I could take this first because I just looked and I'm running way over on my childcare and need to get back to a 4-month-old. So that's one of my challenges that I'm experiencing now, is time feels very different. I think one piece that I want to put on, which I didn't bring up in the context of the second answer of talking about the project, but I think is really important, or that if we're throwing out objectivity and we're really in a space, a relational space, and thinking about our own embodied experiences, that means that like all of the huge issues of injustices also happen in our most intimate relationships. And so I think some of the biggest and most important and hardest parts of doing this work, especially as a white woman who's been working in and through and in support of Black women's leadership, have been the like intimate ways of how do we undo racism in our relationships? How do we show up for conversations that are hard? Knowing that part of being and loving people is showing up for the hard stuff, not just the easy stuff. But that like that opportunity of we can figure this out in our smallest forms, and that what we are in the smallest is actually how we grow to our biggest. That's the opportunity of why it matters so much to be doing anti-racist work, as intimate work and relationship. And it's also hard as hell. And so I think that's the piece of like, how do we stay in it? How do we show up? How do we develop the big listening skills? Like, where do we go for white people who are doing this work? Where do we go that is not relying on people of color in our midst to have to like call us out on stuff? Like, what are the study spaces that we need to be in addition to be able to be really showing up in this work? And I think that process for me, the long range of it is what I learned from some of my old movement heads in Philly, the kind of process of changing ourselves to change the world, that doing this work, we are all going to be changed in. And one of the hardest and most necessary is how we work to dismantle systems of oppression in our intimate relationships so that we can dismantle them on the largest scales possible. So I wish that I could stay and listen to all of your answers to that, Harold. Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. And I'll get to tune in on the video recording too.
Thanks for that, Laura.
Thank you, Laura. That's awesome. I would say one of the big challenges that we face is the kind of exhaustion and fatigue that comes with precarity. A lot of our community partners are that they don't necessarily do their work full time. They have other jobs and other things, other kinds of obligations. We also have partnered with very small organizations that because they're very small, there's a level of precarity. And then in addition to that, there's a lot of social upheaval right now, and a pandemic that I'm not sure what stage of the pandemic we're in right now. I think that's something we're all trying to figure out. But I think there's just a lot going on that's left a lot of people just feeling very, very tired and very stretched in terms of their emotional resources. And so working with folks that are kind of struggling with that, it means like, let's make big plans, and somebody then coming back and saying like, I have to reschedule this because I've had this or this coming up, and then we have to like try again. Or someone saying, you know what, I really can't, I thought I could do this, but I really just don't have the bandwidth for this right now. Again, it's sort of it's along the lines of the thing I mentioned earlier about the timeline issue, right? And that tension with this idea that, especially when it comes to things like grants and or just these more conventional ways of thinking about success, right? That we're supposed to be producing products, that we're supposed to meet deadlines, we're supposed to have these things that we're putting out there. But those kinds of priorities don't always, that they don't always sort of coincide with the realities of people's lives and what a lot of our community partners face. And I think we have run into moments where we have this idea that we're trying to do something in this time frame, and then we realize like, wow, this really does not work for our partners. And so how do we navigate and negotiate this? And where do we course correct? Where do we make changes?
Right.
And there's no handbook or guidebook for this, or there's no like, here's the steps you follow to address those kinds of situations. Like it comes through conversations, very, relational conversations, and you just kind of, well, very often you stumble through, right?
Yeah. I think like similar for myself, like it's that timeline piece, and also like, how do you stay, if the goal here, if the what we're after are deep, meaningful relationships, how do you maintain capacity for those that you've already grown and nurtured, and then like make space for new ones as well, as people change. Their capacity for the work changes, their energy or inspiration for the work changes, and you have plans and resources in place to get through this thing, and folks change and things change. How do you stay in relationship once like that work or project, a specific project, is no longer tenable because the project was never the goal in the first place? So I think that's something that I struggle with a lot, is like, how do you stay in relationship, meaningful relationship, while making space for new ones as well?
I'll say something really briefly too. So I'm coming from a bit more interdisciplinary space. I have a background in performance studies, and I had the benefit of doing a certificate in participatory research at UNC as a graduate student. But one of the things I keep coming back to as well is when Laura was describing this work as community driven instead of community engaged. And I think that that's a really important shift and focus, because I feel like in my experience, there's something that's automatically a bit broken when you start from the university context, because you like start with your project and you need to go and find a community partner, right? And so I was fortunate enough to have seed grants and different things to help me try to develop some of those relationships. But even as my project unfolded, I kind of had different partners at each stage because it was based on their capacity, what they were doing. And it was my project, right? It wasn't theirs. So I think that also finding ways that we can start with that community drivenness is a really important thing. And that's one of those issues that I don't know how that works yet with the way that academia and institutions are currently set up, because it feels like that's kind of the big tension of how do we get to community driven as the starting place and not as like, I'm doing this thing, come along with me. So
Thanks for
Yeah,
that.
thank you for. Mhm. Definitely.
I am aware of the time that we're at 10:35 right now, Central. And perhaps have gone a little longer than some folks were anticipating. This has been a fantastic conversation, and thank you everyone. And Margaret and Andrew, thank you for your questions and for your and comments and engagement. I know we could keep talking about this for a very long time. And in some ways we will through our subsequent webinars. We will also be creating as part of this larger project, we're creating a resource website. It's not up yet, but we do have the URL, which is groundedknowledge.org. And we'll have these videos. We're working on a mapping project where we will highlight various projects that you can sort of check out if you want to look at sort of models and how folks are doing this work. We'll have an essay series where people kind of write about pressing issues and links to a number of different resources. And then additionally, we are creating an online certificate on we've been saying community-based research and public knowledge. Now I feel like we need to shift to community-driven research and public knowledge. Anyhow, we hope through the certificate that we can cover both some of those kinds of conceptual issues, as well as some of the kind of skills and tools and more practical kinds of things that really help in doing this work. And we hope that the certificate can be a really useful resource, both for folks that have been, maybe more established scholars that have been trained in more conventional methods and that are making a shift in their work to sort of help them rethink how they're going to approach their work. But also for folks like, and Margaret, I really appreciated your comment about having recently finished your PhD and that you're, exploring possibilities. And so we hope that a certificate could be a way for folks who are exploring various kinds of vocational possibilities to think about, what they can do with their academic background, but kind of pulling in some other kinds of tools and approaches and resources to, open up new pathways to doing. And I, one of the things we've talked about too is thinking about, how we can be a scholar in different contexts. And many of us have been trained in one context, but what does it mean to imagine like being a scholar in a very different kind of context? So kind of opening up and exploring the different contexts in which scholarship can take place. So those are things that we have ahead of us, and we'll be sure to share them with y'all. We have your email addresses now, so we'll reach out and share the rest of our work. And again, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks you all. And thanks Tiffany and Elizabeth for organizing this and putting it together.
Well, and thank you to our speakers. It was really wonderful hearing all of your stories. So thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Day. Until next time, everyone.
Be well.
Bye.